Welcome to the Science for the Public lecture series. Science for the Public is an organization committed to bringing science information and issues to the general public. Visit our website for our program listings and blog.
Good evening. I'm Yvonne, staff for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. Tonight, the topic is evolution, specifically the coevolution of organisms and the planet. And to discuss this, we have one of the leaders, and probably the leader, in firmly establishing the nature of that coevolution, Andy Knoll, Fisher Professor of Natural History and Professor also of Earth and Planetary Sciences, Harvard University. Dr. Knoll is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Academy of Microbiology. He's received many awards, and there's a list on tonight's event page on our website, which includes a link to his Harvard website. One of those awards I do want to mention was the Phi Beta Kappa Book Award in Science for his outstanding 2003 book, Life on a Young Planet, The First 3 Billion Years of Life on Earth, which we'll also discuss tonight. Dr. Knoll's scientific contributions are so extensive, it's hard to know where to begin or end. So I'm going to try to take a deep breath and summarize first by saying Dr. Knoll is a great scientist who, among other things, pioneered methods for identifying biological traces of very ancient organisms that did not have or leave shells or bone in that period. Tonight, Dr. Knoll shares his scientific adventures in tracing the relationship between the evolution of life and the evolution of this planet, and his contributions to identifying these traces of ancient organisms in sediments and rocks. This expertise has been applied also to his work on the NASA's Mars Exploration Rover mission, which has led the search for the history of that planet. It is a very great honor to welcome Dr. Andy Knoll. Dr. Knoll, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And I'd like to ask right out front, since this is one of the things you're so well known for, about the coevolution of life and the planet. We usually hear evolution of organisms, and the rest of it is dropped out. But you've spent decades on putting this together. What does it mean?
Well, I should say that the idea that life and the physical planet are sort of intricately bound both in space and time certainly didn't originate with me. In fact, I've recently been reading a biography of Alexander von Humboldt, who 200 years ago articulated a clear vision that we couldn't understand individually the rocks, the trees, the insects, the birds, that we had to actually understand them as a system with interacting parts. Now, in all honesty, it was another 150 years before scientists started taking that vision seriously. But now there's really a discipline called Earth System Science, and biological processes interact with physical processes on the Earth, and that determines the nature of the world we live in.
And how does that work? So can you give like an example? Because we think that people like you, the geology, you go out, you look at the rocks and bring back samples and so on, but we don't have a very good idea of how that rock has changed, how the sediments have changed as a result of life, or vice versa.
Right. Well, one of the things that you have to understand about rocks is they have patterns in them. There are physical patterns, there are chemical patterns, and if what we'd love to do is to look at an ancient rock and interpret those patterns in terms of the processes, including biological processes that contributed to its formation, and we would like to sort of extract a record of what the state of the environment was. What was it like to be around at that time? And in order to do that, we actually have to start on the present day world and look at places where sediments are accumulating on the seafloor. And in modern rocks, we can actually see how microorganisms, let's say, contribute to the patterns that we see in the sediments. Then, armed with that, we can go back to rocks that are 1 billion years old and draw inferences about the role of both biology and geological processes in shaping what in fact was a very different environment early in Earth history.
So the organisms that you dealt with largely were microorganisms. These interacted with the geology of the Earth, is that right? And the chemistry of the atmosphere and so on?
Yes, and they still do. You know, when we walk down the street, we can be forgiven for noticing plants and animals and not much else. But even today, the processes that cycle carbon through the biosphere, that cycle sulfur and nitrogen, all the elements that are important to us as organisms, those cycles are completed largely by microorganisms. We're really guests in their world, not the reverse.
Which is an interesting irony that we keep trying to get rid of bacteria all the time, but we ought to be nice to them.
It's a terrible mistake. I mean, the great thing that everyone feels queasy when they first hear this, but you and I each have something on the order of 1,000 different types of bacteria
and couldn't survive.
In and on our bodies, and we could not live without them. Very few of those bacteria are harmful to us. Many of them don't really affect us one way or another, but some of them are responsible for training your immune system, for breaking down compounds so you can digest them, even for the proper development of your digestive tract. So again, we very much live in a world that's shaped by bacteria. And the important thing in terms of Earth history is that life had existed for 3 billion years before the first animals came on the scene. So everything, all the circuitry of processes that sustain habitable environments on this planet, that's really determined by microorganisms.
Right. Did microorganisms have anything to do with particular types of rocks or sediments that formed?
Oh, absolutely. You know, we're used to thinking of younger limestones that are made largely of shells, and so that's very much a biological influence on how sediments are forming. But if you go back farther in time, you find that microorganisms were very much shaping the way carbonate minerals precipitated and form structures on the seafloor. You know, if you go back to the first half of Earth history, there are these beautiful red rocks called iron formation, which are a mixture of mostly iron oxides and silica, so just quartz. And those very much are a product of microbial metabolism on a world without oxygen. So in ways both small and large, microbes have left a signature throughout Earth history.
Right, so all that stuff we're mining.
Yes, that's, in fact, that is the source of most of the iron that we've used commercially for the last 1,000 years.
Right. So there's a term, biogeochemical, which is kind of intimidating, but you work so much on that. What is that then in relative to this coevolution?
Okay. Well, if we break it down, first of all, there's chemistry. And I'm always fond of saying that life is chemistry with a history. That is, all organisms, there are chemical pathways that we all have and we use in gaining energy and carbon and making the constituent parts of our bodies. And because of evolution, the ways we do that actually changes through time. So there's the chemistry. The bio then comes from the fact that organisms participate in chemical cycling, and the geo comes in because Earth processes also participate. So if you could actually label a carbon atom, you know, it might be in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere one day, photosynthesis would put it in a plant the next day, that plant would be eaten by an animal the next day. In time, some of that carbon would just start accumulating on the seafloor. And then geology takes over. It will sit there for perhaps 100 million years or more, and then geological processes will push it into mountains. It will erode, it will go back into the atmosphere, and so there is this beautiful cycling of carbon, and it has rapid biological wheels and larger, longer-term geological gears.
That's beautiful, actually. But there's a cycle, and there are cycles. Are there cycles with other elements as well?
Yes, there's a biological. Well, there's a sulfur cycle, which is populated almost exclusively by microorganisms. Nitrogen cycles, iron cycles, and in fact, when you look through Earth history, these cycles are linked. So for the first half of Earth history, before there was much oxygen in the atmosphere and surface oceans, the iron cycle and the carbon cycle were linked very closely. And we see that those relationships change through time in ways we try to understand.
So that was evolving too. Everything really did co-evolve. But in a sense, the planet is alive.
Well, that's what people have suggested. The important thing is that of all the processes that determine the world we live in, many of them are biological. Even when I was a student, it was common to think that the Earth was this passive platform and biology sat on it without interacting with it very much. Now we know that's the farthest thing from the truth, that there's this very, very close, intricate dance between Earth and life.
Right, so changes in one sphere or element of that aspect of that then changes.
That's right, and they can push in both directions.
Exactly, exactly. How do you retrace evolution? We usually think your little pick, How do you go about this looking for what you look for?
Well, in a sense, that's what you do. You go to the rocks and you take your pick, and in my case, we have to bring them back to the laboratory to process them because if there are fossils, they're tiny, and many of the signatures of life are actually chemical signatures. But what we do is what someone studying dinosaurs would do. It turns out that through the work of thousands of geologists for more than a century, we have a pretty good sense of the distribution of rocks of different ages around the world. So if I'm interested in, let's say, the dawn of animal life, I would go to the library and say, where would I find exceptionally well-preserved outcrops of rocks that are 600 million years old? And then I identify those, and then if the world works the way it should, I can go and look at them and collect rocks. So we don't go blindly into the field. We go where previous geological work has told us we have a good chance of success.
And you know what kind of rock you're looking for and so on.
Absolutely.
So in your case where you're looking for microbial signatures, then you can take the samples and you may not be able to really analyze them on site, is that it? But you take them back and look at them.
You learn two things on site. One is because sedimentary rocks are laid one bed on top of another through time, you get a sense of time by studying the rocks in sequence. And also because, in particular, the physical characteristics of sedimentary rocks are a very good guide to the environment in which they were deposited, we get really this multidimensional sense of time and space, and that's the framework we establish, and that we then collect samples within that framework and then bring them back. So a lot goes on in the field. A lot of reading Earth history goes on in the field.
If I recall, I think that you mentioned maybe in the book that in Spitsbergen, which is mighty cold now, that the rock you were looking at, you could just tell instantly this used to be a tropical sea. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. And again, it's because of the physical and chemical characteristics of the rock.
Right.
We can actually find limestones that are very similar in their character to these 800 million year old rocks from Spitsbergen. And if we look at their modern analogs, they're in places like the Bahamas. So yes, what is at high latitude now was not always at high latitude.
Exactly. So, but you can just identify like its history in a lot of ways just by looking at the rock with this kind of skill. Are there preferred rocks
Well,
in terms of the microbial, I guess,
it turns out
signatures?
that different type of rocks tell you different things. So a rock that's particularly good for preserving bacterial fossils is something called chert or flint. It's basically quartz or silicon dioxide, and that actually forms almost like a plastic in the rocks and just envelops these textures so that I can collect these cherts in the field, bring them back to the lab, cut paper-thin slices of them, and then look at them under the microscope, and you see microorganisms that were entombed 1 billion years ago when you do that. So.
That's amazing. But the other interesting thing is that you kind of know they're in there as well,
Well, you hope
right?
they're in there.
One of the wonderful things about the book that I thought was very charming when I read it was the references to Jacob Marley, Facts of Evolution. And I wonder if you'd give us a little background how you decided to call them the Jacob Marley Facts of Evolution, and then we'll ask you about what those are then.
Well, just because in reading A Christmas Carol by Dickens, there's this wonderful passage in the beginning that he says, Jacob Marley is dead as a doornail, and if you don't understand that, you will never understand the wonders of my story. And it just seemed to me that that was maybe
That's
a nice
really
way to underscore some of the things that you really had to know in order to understand what I think is a terrific yarn about the history of life.
Exactly. And then there were like maybe 3 big points, three facts of evolution in the Jacob Marley sense there. And I wonder if you would discuss those.
Sure, those are big topics, but let's tackle
That's
metabolism
right,
first.
yes.
So metabolism is simply, in some ways, the chemical reactions that go on inside a body. And in a particular interest with respect to interactions with the environment is what we might call energy metabolism. So plants, which are photosynthetic, take CO2 and water and using energy from light convert that into sugar and oxygen gas. We, on the other hand, are respiring, and we ingest organic materials, react them with oxygen during respiration, and that's how we get our energy, and then we get rid of, as byproducts, CO2 and water. So the two processes together actually make a cycle. So metabolism is very important in that metabolism is essentially the set of processes by which organisms interact chemically with the physical earth. Now, isotopes are a little bit more complicated, but they're very, very useful. So we know that there are elements, 118 or however many there are now. So oxygen is an element, carbon is an element, but it turns out that most elements come in different sizes. And what do I mean by that? Let's take carbon. That about 99% of all the carbon atoms on Earth have 6 protons and 6 neutrons. So they have a weight of 12. About 1% of the carbon atoms have an extra neutron. So it's carbon-13, so a little bit heavier. And then about a part per trillion is carbon-14, which is radioactive and decays on a scale of a little over 5,000 years half-life. Now, carbon-13 and carbon-12 are both carbon in the sense that they will form the same kind of chemical bonds and have the same kind of interactions. But because they have different weights, the probability of carbon-12 versus carbon-13 participating in these reactions is a little bit different. The rates at which they participate are a little bit different. And that ends up giving us signatures we can see through time. So for example, in photosynthesis, plants will incorporate carbon dioxide with carbon-12 in it in preference to carbon dioxide with carbon-13. And the difference between the environment and the carbon in plants, because of this photosynthetic reaction, is about 25 parts per thousand pretty small, but you can actually measure that with a mass spectrometer. And so what's great about that is I can go back to a rock that's 3 billion years old and have confidence that there was a biological carbon cycle driven by photosynthesis because that isotopic signature is preserved in the rocks. And so we can study the biological participation in the carbon cycle, in the sulfur cycle, in the nitrogen cycle, because of the way that organisms fractionate these isotopes.
That's really particularly interesting since it's sort of invisible to look at.
Right.
And it's also very accurate. It sounds like it's very accurate. How old is that method? Did you develop this over time, or?
Well, I wouldn't say that I developed the chemical methods. Some of the earliest uses of isotopes were done in this famous laboratories of the University of Chicago after World War II. I think our contribution was to say, let's not just pick a sample off the shelf and look at its chemistry, but let's actually collect our samples in that framework of time and space, and then use that as the framework for interpreting the isotopic geochemistry. And that has actually been very useful because it shows that chemistry varies as a function of environment. What a surprise there. And also it shows us that the carbon cycle has worked differently through time. There are systematic variations through time that tell us something about just the environmental history of the planet.
So it's quite a record, actually.
If you learn how to read it, it's pretty good.
That's right. Come back to that. I want to talk about that boundary period there before the Cambrian.
Right.
And that apparently that was one of the features of it that you came up with. So we had metabolism as one thing, and then the isotopes.
Right.
Which is probably less familiar but extremely important for people, and then geological changes and oxygen revolution.
Yes. So oxygen, which you and I need to exist for more than about 3 minutes, has a very interesting history over the entire course of our planet's development. And in some ways, oxygen has been a major control on evolutionary history. When we look at rocks deposited before about 2.4 billion years ago, that is sort of the first 2 billion years of Earth history, the fascinating thing to me is that all of the sedimentary rocks from that early era, their chemistry tells us that there was essentially no oxygen in the environment. Now, that's not a problem for life, in that there are many organisms still today that thrive in the absence of oxygen. In fact, there's many organisms that would die when they come in contact with oxygen. And so the basic cycling of carbon, sulfur, nitrogen was established among these so-called anaerobic microorganisms, organisms that don't use oxygen, don't live where oxygen is present. Then, about half a dozen different sedimentary and chemical signatures change about 2.4 billion years ago. And they change in a way that tells us, for the first time in Earth history, oxygen gas is becoming a permanent presence in the atmosphere and surface ocean. So that's one of the great sea changes. And at least in part, that could only happen because of the evolution of a group of bacteria called cyanobacteria. And cyanobacteria are the only organisms that ever evolved the capacity to use water as the source of electrons for photosynthesis. And that's important because when water donates protons for photosynthesis, or electrons for photosynthesis, the product is oxygen gas. So we owe the oxygen-rich atmosphere we have today really to the activity first of cyanobacteria and later of algae and plants. Now, the other thing to say about what happened 2.4 billion years ago is that that oxygen event didn't lead to the modern world. In fact, it led to a sort of an intermediate stage in Earth history called the Proterozoic eon, which lasts not quite 2 billion years. And during that interval, it looks like there was certainly oxygen around, but probably 1 to a couple percent of today's levels.
Okay.
So it's still a very different world. And then only in the last 500 to 600 million years do we get chemical signatures that the kind of oxygen-rich environment that you and I can live in is coming to exist. And of course, what's fascinating about that is on about the same time scale that chemistry suggests the atmosphere and oceans are changing,
Yes.
we start seeing large animals that require a lot of oxygen.
And to that, I'd like to, because that's sort of your period, isn't it? This bridge kind of period.
Well, yeah, in two different ways. One is that there's an interval called the Ediacaran period, which is just before the beginning of the Cambrian, which is when the Cambrian period is when we first start seeing
those weird
shells and things that we can look at and say, that's a mollusk, that's an
Yeah,
arthropod.
right.
The Ediacaran does have animals in it. Most of them are fairly difficult to work out what they are like. It's a period that is bounded at the beginning by one of the largest ice ages we've ever seen. And it's a period when the chemistry of rocks suggests that things are changing. Things are becoming more modern.
Within that change, I think first of all, the oxygen change, was it spotty or just?
Yes. In fact, it's interesting that if you look at the ocean, the record of the oceans, say 100 million years ago, there are short intervals of time when the deep ocean seems to lose all its oxygen. These only last a couple tens of thousands of years. They're called ocean anoxic events. And a friend of mine, Tim Lyons at the University of California, Riverside, has actually, by analogy to that, suggested that in the Ediacaran period, you had oceanic oxic events. That is, generally oxygen is low, but you have spikes to higher levels and it goes down. And then for some reason, and we still debate what that reason is, very near the Precambrian-Cambrian boundary, oxygen pretty much goes up and stays up.
Okay. Go back to that Precambrian, considerably back. The story we usually hear is, well, with the rise of oxygen, there was this massive kill-off of bacteria that were anaerobic. And but you said that's really not necessarily the case at all. This is much more maybe gradual, and these other bacteria were just fine without.
Yeah, I think bacteria are just fine. Yes, my dear and sadly departed friend Lynn Margulis once talked about an oxygen holocaust, which in some ways pushes all the wrong buttons in a number of ways.
Yes, right. So you know better, right?
But if you go down to Sippowisset Marsh in southern Massachusetts, there's plenty of oxygen at the surface. A millimeter below the surface, there's no oxygen, but there's billions of microorganisms. So there are many environments on Earth today where there is no oxygen, and those organisms whose metabolisms evolved early in Earth history still thrive there. And in fact, we actually require those organisms to complete the biological cycles of carbon and sulfur and nitrogen. So they're important.
Right, and they stayed important in that time. That there was this sort of gradual shift going on. In this time, you, I think, have pointed out there's a lot of, you might say, upheaval in terms of the Earth itself. Is that true, that the Earth, I don't know whether it's tectonic or volcanic or whatever, a few things are going. There's an ice age, or 6 of them, or however many. You said slushy ages, so I'll ask you about that. But there are these Earth things that are affecting how life is changing, apparently.
Well, that's right. Again, it's the idea that Earth and life are interacting. And the interval immediately before the initial radiation of animals is a really, in terms of Earth history, it's very exciting.
Yeah.
It is a time when there's a lot of tectonic change. There are mountains building. There are oceans opening up. There are at least 2 of the largest ice ages we have ever seen. The carbon cycle is working somewhat differently than it does now. And it's really that framework of changing physical environments that provides the stage on which animals first evolve. And so one of the things that we still debate and we're still trying to understand is just how do all these components fit together?
Yeah.
We know they're all there. We know that the product of all of this at the end of the day was an oxygen-rich world with large animals in it. And exactly how the different components of the environment fit with the biology is still a very active subject.
Okay, so there is a good bit of controversy or disagreement or whatever around
well, hopefully,
it,
if we knew everything, there'd be no
right,
point
so
in being
boring.
a scientist.
Exactly. But in this really interesting period where you have the evidently a relationship that might be quite important, that is geological and what do I want to say, maybe atmospheric, is that's changing to the ocean cycles all these cycles are changing a bit. And do you say that that is what leads up to this sudden change by any chance?
Yes, I guess I would say it's necessary but not sufficient.
Okay.
In order to get from a single-celled protist to, let's say, a sponge, there are genetic changes. And one can't forget that there are things going on in the organisms themselves. But I would say that the genetic changes have to work in concert with the environmental changes because you can't, unless you have sufficient oxygen to support, say, large carnivores, which appear for the first time in the Cambrian period, they can't evolve. So it remains, in some ways, I always think of this as having genetic possibility and environmental opportunity, and the two actually link together. And in a sense, that's not too different from what we see maybe on a less grand scale throughout the next 500 million years. That is, the environment changes, that makes possible new innovations. And at the same time, sometimes new biological innovations will push the environment in a direction that will have consequences for biology. So it isn't simply that this dance of Earth and life played out in the deepest of Earth history. It plays out today, and of course, we are living at a time of geologically rapid change in the environment. And I think we have to be aware that life is going to respond to those changes as well.
Exactly. In that period, then these first organisms, I think, were colonies. I think you've pointed that out. So you have the sponges, you have the jellyfish kinds of things. These are symbiotic relationships, it seems like, very often. Is there a reason for that?
Well, certainly, in order to have any chance of interpreting these oldest animal fossils, you have to look for the clues that we might get from organisms that are living today that still have some of the features that evolved early in animal history. So sponges, which have very few cell types, limited organization, in some ways a sponge is really a bacterial reactor. There are many more bacterial cells than sponge cells in a sponge. And those bacteria interact with the sponge cells.
So no organs, correct?
No particular organs. And then there's a group that most people don't even know about called placozoans, little animals that are only a few millimeters long that live in the oceans today. And those are basically little more than sheets of cells with a little bit of fluid in between them. And they get their organic matter by absorbing molecules. They get their oxygen by absorbing oxygen. And we think that many of the first macroscopic or larger animals we see during this Ediacaran period were actually somewhat similar. They were much larger, but they seem to have been upper and lower cell sheets, maybe a little jelly, like the jelly of a jellyfish in between them. And so these little rare animals that live today may tell us something important about how the animals that are most conspicuous in the early record first functioned. And then finally, the cnidarians, which we think of as corals, jellyfish, Portuguese man-o-war, and that. Again, they have tissues, but they don't have complicated organs. And if you look at the complexity of a Portuguese man-o-war, it's because it actually is a colony. It might have a dozen different individuals in it. One will be specialized for reproduction, one is specialized for being afloat, one is specialized for predation or defense.
Digestion,
and that.
right, yeah.
And before we had a world populated by organisms like us that have discrete organ systems, that was the way to get complex, was to be colonial.
It's just a very interesting characteristic that it went that way that seems very logical when you
Right, it was in some ways it was the only game in town.
Yeah.
And then toward the end of the Ediacaran period, we see the first evidence of things that have bilateral symmetry, that is a head-tail, a line of symmetry that separates the two sides. And organisms that have that kind of symmetry have organs, digestive systems. And so rather than specializing individuals within a colony for different functions, you specialize organ systems within an individual. And of course, today, we don't really know how many species of animal there are, but a lot of people think there's 10 million of them. And of those, all but about 20,000 are bilaterians. So once you get these groups that make organs, they have possibilities for
and become
evolution.
very diverse.
Absolutely.
And there. So a couple of things. First of all, I'd like to just go back to that Ice Age business again, because you had, I think, quite a bit to say about it. There was a big die-off, is that correct, in that period? Was there a big loss of species during that time?
Well, what we see, and it's quite remarkable, that in rocks right at the bottom of or just below the Ediacaran period, almost anywhere you look in the world, you see types of rocks that are formed only by glacial transport of sediment. So it's a real signature for climate. And as early as 1964, Brian Harland, who was the person who first introduced me to Spitsbergen, wrote a paper saying, these things are all over the world. There must have been a global ice age. And then using tools of paleomagnetism, which allowed people to say these glaciers were reaching sea level within 10 degrees of the equator, which is something very different from the world we know. It became clear that, in fact, there was this world of ice. And my friend and now retired colleague Paul Hoffman at Harvard coined the term snowball Earth. Well, actually, Joe Kirschvink at Caltech first coined it, but Paul really worked out what was going on in an interesting way. And there's no question that these were uniquely large ice ages. There's still debate as to whether the entire Earth was swaddled in ice or whether there was at least some free areas in contact with the ocean. But it was really cold. It was very different from today. And yes, actually a paper that I wrote with the late Gonzalo Vidal years ago suggested, and more recent evidence has supported the idea that some of the diversity, particularly of algae and protozoans that we see leading up to these ice ages, disappears. So certainly there was a culling of diversity at the time of these ice ages. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that many lines of organisms existed through the ice ages and persevered. And that's one of the things that leads me to believe there at least have to be sizable refuges
Which you called slushy.
Well, yes, that was to differentiate it from a hard snowball.
Okay.
Right.
They weren't just covered with ice, completely shivering away down there.
Well, that's what we think. That's what we think. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Do you see this as kind of an enabling of what comes later, this diversity that springs up?
I don't as much as Paul Hoffman would. I think one of the things we have to bear in mind is it isn't as though there's ice here on a Thursday and then all of a sudden we have big animals on Saturday.
Right, walking around, yeah.
The first record we have of large animals that you can see with your naked eye is really about 50 million years after this.
So it took a while.
So it took a while. Certainly these major ice ages are part and parcel of a series of changes to the atmosphere and oceans and how the carbon cycle is working. And that whole framework eventually ends up with a world with more oxygen. And that then is a world where you can have trilobites and things like that.
Right, but it took that. What I'm not clear on is whether that would have happened without the ice age, the period in there where there's just so much going on in that period that we...
Yeah. That's a really good question, and I don't think we know the answer.
Okay.
It's a little bit hard to know what things would have been like if something didn't happen, because it
tropical.
did happen.
Right, exactly.
So we know that you have certain genetic requirements for large animals. It's not obvious to me that an ice age is forming that to any extent. But as I said, you also need environmental changes. And at the very least, I think the ice ages were part of this Earth system change that leads to
that these two things went together. The climate, the geology, all of these things were part and parcel of something.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
They are all part of, in some ways, some of the largest changes the Earth has ever seen, and a world with animals is the consequence.
Right. I'd like to ask about your work with the Mars exploration rover project, NASA's project. I know you've been very much involved in this. I don't know how much our viewers know about this project. What is the application of this tremendous background and expertise to that?
Well, I became involved in this in the late 90s when a guy named Steve Squires from Cornell was putting together a proposal to NASA. And Steve wisely thought that he didn't want a science team just made up of people who built and ran instruments, but that he wanted some geologists who could actually read the rocks. And so several of us joined the team, and by a minor miracle, it was funded. And what was great is that, particularly with the rover opportunity, it was a very exciting moment when the first pictures we saw from the rover when it landed showed that it had landed about 5 meters from an outcropping of sedimentary rock.
Oh my goodness.
And so once you know there are sedimentary rocks and stratigraphy, that is layers of rocks, then really what we did for the next decade is what I've done my whole life in the field. You measure the sections, you look at the physical and chemical characteristics of the rock, and through that, and in conjunction with other information that other missions have given us on Mars, we've been able to build an increasingly good environmental history of our neighbor planet.
That's just an amazing, all remote.
All remote. That's
remote.
Right. That's right.
And what have you learned about that planet that interests you most?
I think one of the things that's interesting is if you look at Mars today, it is a desperately cold and hostile place. It's probably not a place that you would think of as a good environment for any life we know about today. And so the question was, and this goes back many years, people suggested that maybe that's Mars today, but possibly early in its history, Mars was very different and much more like Earth. And even as early as the 1970s with the Viking missions, it became clear that when you look at the Martian surface, there are channels on it, and those channels are made by running water. So we know that there is a water history on Mars, and one of the things that we learned through the MER mission is that the transition from a certainly wetter and possibly wet Mars to the very forbidding Mars that we see today actually happened fairly early in Mars history. That is, it's hard to know dates exactly on Mars, but about 3 billion years ago, which is when we're seeing life becoming abundant on Earth, that is when habitable environments are waving goodbye on Mars. And since that time, well, to give you an example of how we know that Mars has been very cold and dry for a long time, there are certain minerals that formed early in Martian history, more than 3 billion years ago. And those minerals require water to form. But on Earth, those minerals don't last very long, because if they stay in contact with water, eventually they will transform into something else. And the simple observation that these sort of juvenile minerals, if you will, that formed billions of years ago are still sitting there suggests that over extremely long time periods, they have seen very, very little water. And many lines of evidence actually agree on that Mars dried out and it stayed dry, basically.
Right. Yeah. It's amazing that you could do this by remote and be so accurate. And what a project. I think Squires is heroic. Coming up with this thing.
Yes,
I wanted to go on with some other things. I will have to say quickly that I hope you write another book. This is basically for the general public. I think it is very readable, very interesting, and one of the richest sources by far for evolution in general, because it's so comprehensive and it's a really helpful book. So I hope that people will get it. It's in the libraries, and regret that I cannot go on. We're about out of time, but I really appreciate your giving us this wealth of information. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was fun.